They say if you stand in front of a mirror, whisper her name 3 times, the lights will flicker and she'll appear, pale, angry, drenched in blood. They call her Bloody Mary. But before the legend became a child's dare, she was Mary Tudor, the first queen to rule England in her own right, a daughter, a believer, a woman born into the shadow of power and burned by it. Her story isn't written in the language of ghosts. It's written in betrayal, faith, and the unbearable loneliness of a woman fighting to survive in a man's empire. For centuries, history painted her as a monster, a queen who burned her people alive in the name of God. But what if the real story is darker and more human? What if Bloody Mary wasn't the devil they told us she was, but a broken soul trapped between love, power, and divine fear? Tonight we step beyond the myth and into the life of Mary I of England, the forgotten Tudor queen, the child who lost her mother to her father's hunger for a son, the heir stripped of her name, the woman who rose from disgrace to wear the crown and rule a country that already feared her. This isn't just the story of a queen, it's the story of how trauma can twist faith into fire and how power can turn pain into legacy. Because behind every monster history creates, there's a human heart that once broke. Before we call her Bloody Mary, let's meet Mary, the girl who bled long before she burned. And before we uncover the truth they never taught you in school, make sure you subscribe, because history only remembers those who choose to look deeper. Mary Tudor was born in 1506 in a world built for kings, not queens. Her birth should have been a celebration, the long-awaited heir to the Tudor dynasty. But when the midwives whispered the words, "It's a girl," disappointment filled the royal chambers. Still, King Henry VIII adored his daughter. He called her his pearl of the world. As a child, Mary's laughter echoed through the halls of Greenwich Palace. She was bright, talented, and precociously intelligent, speaking Latin, French, and Spanish before most girls could even write their names. To her father, she was proof that the Tudors would shine forever. To her mother, Catherine of Aragon, she was the embodiment of God's will, a symbol of divine purpose in a kingdom obsessed with bloodlines. But the walls of palaces often hide cracks invisible to children. As Mary grew, whispers began to rise about her father's restlessness, his frustration with God for denying him a son, and his gaze turning toward another woman. For years, Mary watched the world she knew bend under her father's ambition. She was only 9 when Henry's infatuation with Anne Boleyn began to reshape England itself. What began as flirtation soon became a storm that would tear her family apart. Her mother, Catherine, refused to accept annulment. She believed her marriage was sacred, bound by both law and heaven. Mary saw her mother's dignity tested, her crown stripped, and her honor trampled. Overnight, she went from Princess Mary to Lady Mary, a title carefully chosen to humiliate her. The court that once bowed to her now treated her with pity or contempt. For the first time, she understood the cruelty of power. It could rewrite names. It could erase love. It could take everything. Henry VIII was not just her father. He was a god in his own kingdom, a man who made and unmade truth. When he broke from the Catholic Church to marry Anne Boleyn, England followed. But Mary did not. Her loyalty to her mother's faith never wavered. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. Yet that loyalty branded her as an enemy of the new order. She became a symbol of resistance in a land divided by faith. The once beloved daughter now stood as a silent threat to her father's throne. The betrayal wasn't sudden, it was gradual, like watching a candle die out one breath at a time. Letters from her mother were censored, her servants were dismissed, even her right to see Catherine was denied. When word came that her mother had fallen ill, Mary begged to visit her. Henry refused. She must learn obedience, he said, a sentence that broke both their hearts. When Catherine of Aragon died alone in 1536, Mary wasn't allowed to attend the funeral. The girl who had once dined beside kings was forbidden even to mourn. From that moment, something inside her hardened. She had lost her mother, her title, her safety, and perhaps worst of all, her faith in human mercy. The spark of kindness that once lit her eyes dimmed, replaced by quiet resolve. Mary had learned that love, in royal bloodlines, was conditional. Power demanded sacrifice, and she was the offering. Still, she refused to renounce her beliefs. To her father's new Church of England, she was a heretic. To Protestants, a relic. But to Catholics across Europe, She was their princess, the rightful heir of the true faith. Her every move was watched, every prayer whispered in fear. She lived like a ghost within her own home, haunted by her father's new queen and the possibility of death disguised as royal justice. Yet even in this isolation, Mary held her composure. Her education, her discipline, and her faith became her armor. Anne Boleyn, the woman her father had risked everything for, soon fell from grace and was executed. But even after Anne's death, Henry did not forgive his daughter. He demanded that Mary acknowledge him as head of the church and recognize herself as illegitimate. Signing that document would mean denying her mother's marriage and her own existence as a rightful heir. Mary hesitated for months, praying for a sign. None came. In the end, exhausted and afraid, she signed. History records her compliance, but not her tears. She wrote to her father afterwards, saying, "I have offended your majesty, but I pray that my submission may move you to compassion." He did not reply. For the first time, she understood the price of peace. To survive, she had to silence her soul. She returned to court as a daughter in name, but never again as a child of his love. The lessons she learned in those years carved scars that would never fade, that mercy is rare, loyalty is dangerous, and faith can be a weapon wielded by kings and God alike. Psychologists today might call what she endured chronic humiliation trauma, a lifetime of being stripped of control, one identity at a time. But Mary's world had no such language. In the 16th century, grief turned into prayer, and pain turned into faith. Every wound drove her closer to religion, not out of devotion, but desperation. She believed that only God could restore what men had taken. That belief would one day ignite her reign. By the time Henry remarried again, Mary had become a quiet, cautious observer of the court. She smiled when expected, curtsied when required, but inside she carried memories sharp as glass. She had seen what happens to women who defy power. They are rewritten as villains. In her solitude, she built walls of righteousness around her heart. Those walls would protect her, but they would also imprison her. History often forgets that before Mary became the feared Bloody Mary, she was a child who watched her family disintegrate in front of her. Her father's crown glittered, but her nights were cold. She once said, "I am the daughter of a queen, yet I live as a servant." That contradiction would define her entire life, a royal heir trapped in the ruins of her parents' sins. By the time she reached adulthood, Mary was no longer the bright girl who danced in palace halls. She was something different now, someone forged in silence, steadied by sorrow, and determined never to be powerless again. And so, when history later watched her light the flames of persecution, few remembered the fires that first burned her. When Anne Boleyn became queen, England's heart turned cold toward Mary I. The girl who had once been the pride of the realm now lived in quiet exile within her own country. She was stripped of her title, her household, and her dignity. Anne had given birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, and Henry rejoiced as though a son had been born. To secure Elizabeth's future, Anne demanded that Mary be made to serve in the baby's household, a cruel display of dominance that turned Mary from princess to servant. For the young woman who had been raised to believe she was chosen by God, this was more than humiliation. It was a living death. Every morning she was forced to bow before the child who had taken her place. The court whispered behind her back, calling her the bastard lady. She would stand quietly, head bowed, face pale, her voice calm even when her hands trembled. To many, she appeared obedient. To those who looked closer, her silence burned with quiet rage. Mary I's faith became her last refuge. While the court feasted and flirted, she prayed. Her Bible was worn from constant touch, her rosary beads clutched until her fingers ached. Her servants whispered that she barely ate, that she sometimes cried through the night, and that she refused to speak of her father at all. Yet, beneath her sorrow, something unyielding began to grow, a hardness that would later define her rule. Every insult, every order she was forced to obey, carved new lines of resolve into her heart. Anne Boleyn's charm was fading by then. Her failure to produce a male heir turned Henry's affection into fury. Mary I watched from the shadows as the same wheel of power that crushed her mother began to turn against Anne. When the queen was accused of adultery and treason, Mary's world shifted again. She felt no joy at Anne's fall, only grim recognition. The same men who had once praised Anne now called for her death. The court that had mocked Mary now feared her silence. When Anne was executed, Mary wrote to her father, asking for reconciliation. Henry's reply was cold but practical. She could return to favor if she acknowledged him as head of the church and accepted her own illegitimacy. The choice tore at her. She prayed for days, pacing the stone floors, torn between loyalty to her faith and the desperate wish for peace. Finally, exhausted, she surrendered. Signing that document broke something inside her, but it also saved her life. In that moment, she learned the cruel truth of survival under tyranny, that sometimes to endure you must kneel. She returned to court, hollow-eyed but alive, and was allowed to see her father again. Their reunion was cordial but empty. Henry smiled for appearances, yet the warmth of her childhood was gone forever. In the years that followed, Mary I lived between two worlds, tolerated by her father, distrusted by courtiers, and pitied by those who once feared her. She attended banquets, smiled at diplomats, and played her role as the obedient daughter, but the light within her had dimmed. She had learned that courtly life was theater, not truth. The actors who played loyal servants one day could be executioners the next. Her trust in people, once tender and hopeful, turned brittle. She grew cautious, suspicious, and inward. As Henry's health declined, his need for heirs intensified. He married again and again, each wife a new wound to Mary's already fragile heart. She saw stepmothers come and go, some kind, some cruel, all temporary. When Henry finally fathered a son, Edward, Mary knew her fate was sealed. She would never be England's chosen heir. Still, she treated her half-siblings with gentleness, even Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. There was no hatred in her gestures, only the resignation of someone who had seen too much betrayal to waste energy on bitterness. But the court never forgot what she represented, the old faith. To reformers, Mary I was a living reminder of the past they wanted to erase. Priests whispered to her in secret, smuggling letters of encouragement from loyal Catholics abroad. Spies followed her prayers, counting how many times she crossed herself. To them, faith was no longer sacred, it was political. Mary lived under constant watch, her every act of devotion recorded as potential treason. In private, she wrote letters to her cousin, the Emperor Charles V, pleading for protection and understanding. In her words, you can feel both fire and exhaustion. She called herself a soul abandoned by men but not by God. Even then, her faith was not the gentle comfort it once had been. It was iron, unyielding, absolute, and burning. She had learned that human love could betray, but divine love demanded obedience, even if it hurt. The young Mary who once played music and laughed in palace gardens had disappeared. In her place stood a woman molded by fear and faith, two forces that often disguised themselves as strength. Her eyes had lost the softness of youth. They were steady now, cold, reflective, almost regal. Every humiliation had taught her something about endurance. Every betrayal had made her less human, more symbol. Historians often debate whether Mary I's later cruelty came from ideology or pain, but anyone who traces her life can see that cruelty was never her beginning. It was her inheritance. She had watched power twist her father into a tyrant. She had watched religion divide her nation. She had watched innocence be punished, loyalty destroyed, and truth rewritten. When you live long enough in such darkness, you start to mistake it for light. By the time Henry VIII died, Mary was nearly 40, unmarried, and scarred by decades of political games. She had survived where others perished, not through cunning, but through endurance. Yet that endurance came at a cost. She trusted no one fully, not even herself. Every smile felt rehearsed, every act of kindness a test. Deep inside, she still carried the child who had once begged to see her dying mother, who had once believed that love could conquer cruelty. But that child's voice had grown faint. England would soon see her rise again, this time not as the humiliated daughter, but as the queen who would reclaim everything taken from her. And when that day came, the fires that had burned her soul for decades would finally find their way into the world. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Mary Tudor was 31 years old. She had survived the chaos of 6 stepmothers, 2 religious revolutions, and a lifetime of royal distrust. For the first time, she should have felt safe. But safety was an illusion. Her half-brother, Edward VI, the young boy crowned king, was surrounded by Protestant advisors who viewed Mary as a dangerous relic of the old world. Her belief in Catholicism was no longer seen as private devotion, it was rebellion. To Edward's council, Mary I was a symbol that had to be controlled or silenced. They tried persuasion first, sending bishops to argue scripture, insisting she abandon the Mass. She refused, calmly but firmly. Her letters to the council carried the same message: I owe my conscience to God, not to Parliament. That defiance terrified them. They had seen what happens when a Tudor woman stands her ground. The memory of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, still haunted them. In truth, Mary I was not plotting revolution. She only wanted to live in peace, to practice her faith quietly. But peace has no place in politics. Spies were stationed in her household, recording her prayers, her visitors, even her expressions. When she smiled too often, rumors spread that she was plotting. When she looked solemn, they said she was praying for England's downfall. Every silence became suspicious. Every act of kindness became evidence, and yet she remained unbroken. Mary I had inherited her mother's patience and her father's pride, a dangerous combination. Her defiance made her a figure of hope for Catholics across England. They whispered her name in secret, believing God would restore her to the throne. It was both a blessing and a curse. Wherever she went, eyes followed her, loyalists knelt in hidden corners, and letters from abroad urged her to rise against the government. She ignored them all. She had seen enough of rebellion's price. Still, the pressure grew. Edward's council threatened her with imprisonment if she refused to obey. She answered with grace, but her resolve did not bend. When an envoy told her she must stop attending Mass, she replied, "My soul is not yours to command." The room fell silent. Even her enemies admitted she had courage. But courage in a woman was not seen as virtue. It was defiance against the order of men. Over the next few years, Mary I's position became increasingly fragile. She was not formally exiled, but she lived like one, isolated, watched, and distrusted. She resided mostly in the countryside, away from court, where she could pray in peace. Her estates became her sanctuary. There she surrounded herself with a small circle of loyal servants who still called her "Your Grace," even though the crown no longer recognized her claim. At night, she often sat by candlelight, writing letters in neat, careful Latin. To her cousin, the Emperor Charles V, she confessed her loneliness and fear. "They call me obstinate," she wrote, "but I am only constant in what I was taught." Her words reveal a woman torn between faith and fatigue, a soul weary of struggle yet incapable of surrender. She had spent her entire life bowing to others' wills. Now she refused to bow to her conscience. England itself was changing faster than anyone could comprehend. Churches stripped of icons, Latin replaced by English, monasteries dissolved. To the reformers, it was progress. To Mary I, it was desecration. She felt as if her mother's God was being erased before her eyes. Her prayers grew longer, her fasts more severe, her conviction harder. To her, this wasn't politics, it was salvation. She wasn't fighting for a throne, she was fighting for the soul of a nation. But history is never kind to those who stand against its tide. As Edward's health began to fail, his advisors grew desperate to prevent Mary from inheriting the crown. The idea of a Catholic queen horrified them. They sought to alter the line of succession, naming Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin, as heir. Mary learned of their plan through loyal messengers. She understood immediately. They would rather destroy England than let her rule it. For a moment, fear threatened to consume her. The memories of her father's wrath, her years of humiliation, her mother's death, they all returned. She knew what happened to women who defied powerful men. But then something shifted. Perhaps it was faith. Perhaps it was destiny. She rose from her prayer stool, looked into the mirror, and whispered, "Not again." This time she would not hide. When Edward VI died in July 1553, the council declared Jane Grey queen. Mary I was hunted, declared a traitor, her arrest imminent. But the frightened, obedient girl of the past was gone. She mounted her horse, gathered her loyal supporters in East Anglia, and proclaimed herself the rightful Queen of England. Within days, thousands flocked to her banner. Peasants, nobles, even soldiers who had once sworn to arrest her. The country, tired of manipulation, turned toward her like a tide. Her march to London was not the march of a conqueror, it was the march of a survivor. When she entered the city, The crowds cheered so loudly that even her enemies hesitated. People wept, shouting, "Mary, our true queen!" For the first time in her life, she was no longer the daughter of disgrace or the servant of politics. She was the sovereign of England, and the symbol of restoration for every Catholic heart that had bled in silence. It was a victory written in faith, not fire. Yet, deep inside her triumph, shadows lingered. The years of isolation had left marks invisible to the cheering crowds. The pain of her childhood, the humiliation of her youth, and the loneliness of her exile had fused into something immovable. The fire that now burned in her was not celebration, it was vengeance dressed as justice. Mary I's return to power was not the beginning of peace, but the calm before the storm. Her reign would soon be remembered, not for mercy, but for flames that lit the skies of London. Yet, in this moment, standing before the crowd, her hand raised, her eyes lifted to heaven, she believed she was chosen, not by politics, but by God Himself. And, when a ruler believes that their crown is a divine command, not even blood can make them hesitate. The summer of 1553 marked a moment England had not seen in generations, the rise of a queen in her own right. When Mary I rode into London on August 3rd, her white horse glinting in the sunlight, thousands knelt as church bells thundered across the city. People climbed windows and rooftops to glimpse her, the exiled heir who had defied the most powerful men in the kingdom. Her red gown shimmered like a banner of victory, and her eyes, once shadowed by fear, now carried the calm of destiny. She entered the capital not as the child cast aside, but as a ruler chosen by both blood and will. The air trembled with emotion. Many saw her ascent as divine justice, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon finally reclaiming what her mother had lost. To the poor, she was a symbol of righteousness. To Catholics, she was the long-awaited deliverer who would restore God's order. But to her enemies, she was a reminder that faith and vengeance can wear the same face. Mary I's first words as queen were humble yet powerful. "I thank Almighty God who has seen fit to make me the instrument of His glory." Those around her wept openly. But beneath that devotion lay fear. Fear of what she would do with the power she had spent a lifetime yearning for. From the first day of her reign, Mary I's actions revealed a mind sharpened by years of suffering. She moved swiftly and with precision. The Duke of Northumberland, who had plotted against her, was executed. Lady Jane Grey, the young woman who had been crowned in her place, was imprisoned in the Tower. Mary hesitated to kill her. The girl was barely 16 and had been a pawn of greater men. Yet mercy, as Mary would learn, is often devoured by politics. The council demanded blood to prove her authority. The queen wept privately, but she signed the warrant. Still, her early days on the throne were filled with celebration. Crowds filled the streets, people shouted her name with hope. Even Protestants, weary of turmoil, welcomed her at first. She promised unity, peace, and restoration of law. For a brief moment, it seemed England had found stability after years of chaos. But stability built on trauma is fragile, and Mary I's scars ran deep. Her coronation in Westminster Abbey was a spectacle of faith and triumph. The great bells rang as she was anointed with holy oil, the same oil once denied to her mother. Tears streamed down her face. For her, this was not just a ceremony, it was redemption. Every humiliation, every betrayal, every prayer whispered in exile had led to this. As the crown touched her head, she whispered a single phrase, "This is for her." The memory of her mother stood beside her in spirit. But in that same moment of triumph, a dangerous idea rooted itself in her heart, that her victory was not political but divine. She began to see herself as God's chosen instrument, tasked with purging her father's sins and restoring the true faith of England. To her, ruling was not governance, it was salvation. Her first mission was to bring England back to Catholicism. She ordered the restoration of Latin Mass, reinstated papal authority, and pardoned priests who had been forced into hiding. Monasteries reopened, processions returned, and the old hymns filled the air once again. For those who still clung to Protestant beliefs, it felt like the world had turned backward overnight. To Mary I, it felt like breathing again. She believed she was healing her country's soul, but her vision of healing was absolute. There could be no compromise between truth and heresy, no middle ground between God and rebellion. In the private chambers of Whitehall, she worked tirelessly, reading letters, meeting envoys, and consulting bishops. Her intelligence was sharp, her discipline unmatched. Even her enemies admitted that her command of law and theology surpassed that of most men in her council. But she was also lonely. Power had made her untouchable. The few she trusted, her cousin Renard, her chamberlain Rochester, and her loyal friend Jane Dormer, often found her pacing at night, muttering prayers under her breath. "I will not fail him," she would say, "not as they failed me." Then came the question of marriage. Parliament urged her to wed, to secure an heir and the Tudor line. Many expected her to marry an English noble, but Mary's gaze turned abroad. To Philip II of Spain, son of her cousin, the Emperor Charles V. To her, Philip represented both political strength and spiritual unity. He was devout, dignified, and powerful. To her people, however, he was a foreign prince, a Spaniard they feared would rule England through her. The thought of a Catholic alliance with Spain terrified the nobles. They remembered the wars, the taxes, and the bloodshed. Yet Mary's mind was set. She saw the marriage as part of God's design, a union to fortify her faith and secure England's salvation. When the betrothal was announced, rebellion followed. Sir Thomas Wyatt led an uprising in early 1554, rallying thousands under the cry that England would not be ruled by a Spaniard. The rebellion spread quickly, and the Queen's advisors begged her to flee. Instead, she stood before the people of London in full regalia, her voice steady and clear. "I am your queen, appointed by God. I will not leave my city nor forsake my people. If it be your will to take my life, I am ready to die among you." The crowd fell silent. In that moment, she became more than a monarch. She became a force. The rebellion collapsed within days. Wyatt was captured and executed. And when the smoke cleared, Mary I's rule was stronger than ever. Even those who despised her faith could not deny her courage. Her marriage to Philip took place that July in Winchester Cathedral. The union was cold, political, and distant, but Mary loved him with a devotion born from years of isolation. He, however, saw her as an obligation, a means to an end. He stayed in England briefly before returning to Spain, leaving her surrounded by rumors of neglect and mockery. The woman who had won a kingdom now faced her old companion again, loneliness. Still, she found solace in one hope, the belief that she was with child. When her body swelled and her sickness deepened, physicians confirmed her pregnancy. England rejoiced, bells rang, prayers rose, and the court prepared for a royal heir. But months passed and no child came. Her belly deflated. Her hope collapsed. The physicians whispered of phantom pregnancy, a cruel trick of the body fueled by longing and faith. It was then, more than ever, that her faith hardened into fury. In her heart, she convinced herself that God was testing her, that England's heresy still blocked divine mercy. The child had not been lost, it had been withheld. And so, to cleanse her realm, she would begin the act that would forever brand her name in fire. The woman who had survived disgrace, exile, and rebellion now ruled with divine certainty. Mary I believed she had been spared by God to restore his truth, even if it meant lighting the flames herself. The year 1555 began with the sound of church bells and the smell of smoke. England, once divided by faith, now trembled under one queen's conviction. Mary I believed she was saving her nation's soul, not destroying it. To her, the heretics who refused the old faith weren't victims. They were the disease. Her mission was not vengeance, she told herself, but purification. And so, the fires began. In the cold courtyards of Smithfield, Oxford, and Canterbury, wooden stakes were raised like altars. Men and women, priests and scholars, were tied to them, accused of heresy for denying papal authority. The first flames licked upward with quiet cruelty. Crowds gathered, some praying, some weeping, some silent in fear. Above them all, church bells rang in grim harmony. The people called her Bloody Mary, but in the Queen's mind, the blood that soaked the ground was not murder, it was sacrifice. Mary I was not the monster history made her out to be. She didn't watch the executions with glee. She rarely attended them at all. But every report that reached her chamber, each confession, each final prayer, reinforced her belief that she was doing God's work. To her, these fires were not punishment, but absolution. If a soul died in the flames repentant, it would rise purified. In her eyes, she wasn't destroying life, she was saving eternity. Her counselors, however, saw something else. a queen consumed by a divine mission that no mortal could question. Bishop Stephen Gardiner, once her loyal advisor, began to falter under the weight of her zeal. He urged her to slow the persecutions, to use mercy as strength. She listened, but did not bend. "Mercy to the heretic," she said, "is cruelty to the faithful." Her words were quiet, but her tone was final. Gardiner died not long after, leaving her surrounded by those too fearful to disagree. The flames spread quickly, carried by her bishops and courts. Prominent Protestants, including Bishops Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer, men who had once shaped her father's church, were condemned. Their trials were public, designed to break spirits and restore order. Yet, even as the accused stood defiant, refusing to recant, Mary I saw not rebellion, but blasphemy. When Latimer and Ridley were burned together, their final words echoed through history. "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." Those words reached Mary's ears, but she only closed her eyes and whispered, "Then may God judge who is right." Inside the royal chambers, her faith deepened into obsession. She prayed constantly, fasting until her body weakened. Her attendants often found her kneeling for hours, whispering prayers with tears streaming down her face. The guilt of her phantom pregnancy still haunted her. She believed the child's spirit awaited redemption, that every heretic burned brought her closer to forgiveness. The Queen's private confessor fed this belief, telling her that her suffering mirrored the trials of the Virgin Mary herself. It was comfort, but it was poison disguised as holiness. The executions multiplied. Nearly 300 men and women would die in the fires before her reign ended. Many were humble citizens, artisans, farmers, even young mothers, accused not because they plotted rebellion, but because they read the Bible in English or refused to attend Mass. The Queen ordered prayers for their souls after each execution. "May they find peace at last," she said. In her mind, their deaths were not cruelty, they were divine justice. But the people saw something different. The same crowds that had once cheered her coronation now watched in silent horror. The smoke from the pyres drifted over cities like a shadow that would not fade. Children were warned to whisper their prayers carefully. Neighbors turned on one another to survive. Fear replaced faith. And though Mary I believed she was uniting her kingdom under God, she was instead dividing it by fire. The rebellion of Wyatt had been crushed, but its ghost lingered. Her marriage to Philip grew colder by the day. He had returned to Spain, leaving her alone once again, surrounded by courtiers who obeyed her out of fear, not love. She wrote letters to him, affectionate, pleading, but his replies were distant, formal, political. "My duties hold me here," he wrote. To Mary, it felt like another betrayal written in ink. She prayed harder, convinced that only God could fill the void Philip left behind. When word came that Philip had conquered new lands for Spain, Mary ordered masses of thanksgiving across England. She called his triumph proof that God blesses the faithful. But even as she spoke the words, she knew he would not return to her side. The loneliness that had haunted her since childhood returned with vengeance. The only constant left in her life was faith and the fires that fed it. In the later years of her reign, witnesses described her as pale and hollow-eyed, her once bright hair now streaked with gray. Yet her voice remained strong. She spoke in Parliament with clarity and command, insisting that obedience to the true faith was the foundation of peace. When members hesitated, she reminded them, "It is not I you defy, but God himself." Few dared to answer. Even fewer believed. The irony of Mary I's legacy was cruel. The woman who sought to save England's soul had become its symbol of fear. The queen who longed for peace had created an era of terror. Her vision of unity through faith had splintered her people beyond repair. But within her, there was no recognition of this contradiction, only the quiet certainty of righteousness. She slept soundly, convinced she was restoring the world her father had broken. Yet there were nights, rare and brief, when doubt crept in. One of her attendants once recalled seeing the queen wake suddenly, trembling, whispering her mother's name. "Have I done right?" she murmured into the dark. But when morning came, the mask of faith returned. She rose, dressed in royal crimson, and faced her council with the composure of a saint preparing for battle. Doubt was a luxury she could not afford. As the fires continued, the rest of Europe watched in uneasy silence. To Spain and Rome, she was a champion of the Church. To France and Germany, she was a warning, a ruler whose conscience burned hotter than any pyre. England's diplomats wrote cautiously, fearing her temper, but pitying her isolation. The Queen's heart is pure, one wrote, but her hands are stained with the work of angels. By 1558, the kingdom was exhausted. The harvest failed, disease spread, and famine loomed. The fires no longer inspired awe, they inspired disgust. Even many Catholics began to question whether this was God's will or human cruelty. Yet Mary I pressed on, her eyes fixed on heaven, her heart too far gone to turn back. She had started as a woman fighting for her mother's honor. She had become a queen fighting for her faith. But somewhere along the way, she had lost herself entirely to the one force she could never master, her own fear of divine failure. Her rule had begun in triumph and would end in tragedy. The fires she lit to save souls would outlive her, not as symbols of piety, but of warning. The same faith that gave her strength would become the weapon that destroyed her legacy. And yet, behind the smoke and horror, one truth remains. Mary I did not set England ablaze out of hatred. She did it out of love, a love twisted by grief, shaped by loss, and blinded by devotion. She believed she was saving the world. But sometimes, the ones who believe they're saving us are the ones who burn us first. By the winter of 1557, Mary I had everything she had once prayed for: the crown, the church, and the authority of God behind her. Yet, she had never felt more powerless. Her body was failing, her people were starving, and her husband, the man she had loved as God's chosen partner, was still an ocean away. England was tired of her wars, her faith, and her fire. The queen who had fought so hard to be heard was now surrounded by silence. Her court had grown thin. Many of her loyal supporters were gone, dead, exiled, or simply weary. Even her most faithful servants avoided her eyes, afraid to mirror the doubt she refused to acknowledge. The Spanish alliance that had once promised unity had delivered only resentment. The marriage she thought divinely ordained had turned into public humiliation. Philip returned to England briefly in 1557, not for love, but for war. Spain had drawn her into a conflict with France, and once again English blood was spilled for a foreign cause. When the news came that England had lost Calais, its last remaining territory in France, Mary I was devastated. To her, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was a personal one. Calais had been English soil for more than 200 years. Losing it was like losing a piece of her nation's soul. As the report was read to her, she sat in stunned silence, her lips trembling. Then she whispered words that history would never forget. "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." The loss broke something inside her. The queen, who had stood unshaken through rebellion and exile, now felt the ground crumble beneath her. For the first time, her faith could not explain her suffering. She began to question in private, not God's existence, but his favor. "Have I angered him?" she asked her confessor, "or does he test me still?" But even as she prayed for clarity, her body began to betray her once again. The phantom pregnancy that had once filled her with hope returned in cruel mockery. Her belly swelled, her symptoms returned, and once more she believed she carried an heir. The court prepared for the child, just as before. But weeks passed, and it became clear that there would be no birth. The truth crushed her. Physicians whispered that she was ill, perhaps with a tumor, perhaps something worse. She ignored them all. "God can still bless the barren," she said faintly. Yet deep down she knew. The womb that had promised redemption had become her greatest torment. As her strength faded, her isolation deepened. The people who had once lined the streets to cheer her name now cursed her quietly. The fires of Smithfield had turned hearts cold. The name, Bloody Mary, spread from mouth to mouth, not shouted in protest, but whispered in fear. She heard it once herself, from a servant who thought she was out of earshot. That night, she didn't pray. She simply sat by the window, staring at the rain sliding down the glass, and whispered, "Do they truly think I hate them?" But hatred was never her fuel. She had ruled from conviction, not cruelty. Every law she passed, every life she condemned, she believed was in service of God and England. Yet the irony of her life was unbearable. The very faith that guided her had turned her people against her. She had fought for unity and won division. She had sought love and found betrayal. She had restored her mother's honor, but at the cost of her own. Even her half-sister Elizabeth, whom she had once mistrusted and imprisoned, now stood as her inevitable successor. The Protestant nobles whispered Elizabeth's name with cautious hope. To Mary, it was the final wound, the thought that everything she had built, every sacrifice she had made, would be undone by the sister who had survived by silence. Still, she could not hate her. When they met in Mary's final days, witnesses said the Queen looked at Elizabeth with a strange tenderness. "You will have the crown," she told her. "See that you do not make the same mistakes I have." Elizabeth said nothing, but her eyes glistened. By late 1558, Mary I's health collapsed entirely. Fever consumed her, and her once steady hands shook as she tried to hold her rosary. Her attendants reported that she spoke often of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, as if she were in the room. "Mother," she whispered, "I have done all I could." Sometimes she spoke of Philip. "Tell him I loved him still, though he would never return." At other times, she murmured verses of scripture about light, redemption, and mercy. The same words she had once used to justify her fires now sounded like pleas for forgiveness. As her life waned, England's skies darkened with an early winter storm. Outside, London's air was cold and gray. Inside the palace, the candles burned low. Mary I lay in her bed at St. Over, James's palace, surrounded by the few who still loved her. Her face, pale and worn, bore the quiet dignity of a woman who had suffered too much to fear death. When the priest asked if she wished to pray for her enemies, she smiled faintly and said, "If they loved God as I do, they would not be my enemies." On the morning of November 17, 1558, the first queen to rule England in her own right took her final breath. The woman who had fought her father, her brother, her council, and even her people, all for the sake of faith, died quietly, with the cross clasped to her chest. She was 42 years old. Her heart, burdened by loss and love, finally stilled. The news of her death spread quickly. Bells rang across London, not in celebration but in weary resignation. Yet by afternoon, the same bells rang again, this time for Elizabeth, the new queen. In the space of a single day, England turned the page. The fires went out, the altars changed, the world moved on, but history never truly left her behind. For centuries, Mary I would be remembered not as the woman she was, but as the legend she became. Bloody Mary, the queen who burned her own people in God's name. Yet beneath that legend was a soul that wanted nothing more than love, faith, and peace. She had inherited her mother's devotion, her father's pride, and the sins of both. In truth, Mary I was never meant to win. Every victory she achieved came wrapped in loss. Every act of love was answered with pain, and every prayer she whispered turned to smoke. But if history teaches anything, it is that those who are broken by their beliefs are often remembered more fiercely than those who live without them. She died believing she had saved England's soul. And perhaps, in some small way, she did. By showing the world that faith without mercy is a crown that burns the one who wears it. Centuries have passed since Mary I's death, yet her shadow still lingers, not just in history books but in mirrors, myths, and whispered names. The world remembers her not as a queen who tried to heal her nation's soul, but as Bloody Mary, the specter of vengeance. Children chant her name before mirrors, waiting for her ghost to appear, never realizing they summon the reflection of a woman who once stood alone in a world that never forgave her. The legend is cruel, but legends often are. They strip away the humanity of those who lived too painfully, leaving behind only the echoes that frighten us. Mary I became that echo. A warning about power, faith, and the fire that burns when conviction outweighs compassion. Yet, if we peel back the smoke, a different story emerges, a story of a daughter abandoned, a woman denied love, and a queen trying to redeem her mother's shame. She was born into a world where women were never meant to rule, and when she finally did, she ruled like someone who had fought for every breath. Her enemies wrote her history, turning her faith into fanaticism and her grief into madness. But those who looked closer saw something else, a ruler who carried her wounds like armor, who prayed for mercy even as she lit the flames of justice. Her successor, Elizabeth I, became the golden icon of English greatness, celebrated for her intellect and restraint. But even Elizabeth ruled in the shadow of her sister. Every act of tolerance, every calculated mercy, stood as a silent contrast to the woman who came before. Mary's reign became the necessary caution, the story that history told to justify the light that followed the fire. And yet, history has a strange mercy of its own. In time, scholars began to see Mary I not as a monster, but as a mirror of her age. A woman born into chaos who tried to bring order the only way she knew. Her tragedy was not that she was cruel, but that she was human in a time that demanded perfection. Today, the name Bloody Mary is still spoken with fear. But perhaps, the next time someone whispers it in front of a mirror, they should remember who she truly was. A lonely queen who carried the sins of her father, the faith of her mother, and the burden of a crown that weighed too heavy for any heart to bear. Mary I's legacy isn't just written in fire. It's written in the silence that follows, in the lesson that power without empathy is hollow, and that even those called monsters were once simply trying to be loved. The flames may have died centuries ago, but her shadow never faded. Mary I's story isn't just history, it's a mirror. A reminder that behind every name we fear, there's a heart that once bled for something it believed in. Power can corrupt, yes, but sometimes it's pain that truly burns the soul. If this story moved you, if you felt the humanity behind the legend, then stay. Subscribe, because we uncover the truths history tried to bury. The forgotten hearts, the misunderstood minds, the untold legacies. Every week, another story rises from the ashes. And maybe, just maybe, one of them will change the way you see power forever. Subscribe now, and never forget the ones history tried to silence.